Well, welcome back to Side Quests, episode 11, special episode here, back with Mr. Wes Schantz during the Christmas holiday, the seasons holiday here in December in the West and US. Wes, welcome back.
Hey, it's great to be here. I've been really looking forward to reading this paper and talking with you about it. And I'm glad that we finally got around to it as much as there's a million other things. It's like, yeah, this is the one for the holiday.
Yes, and we've had some fanfare, and we've been alluding to the fact that this paper existed, and even back in Oxford, we were mentioning it a little bit. And a little while ago, you asked whether it was going to be out in like a week, a month, or like several months. And I was sure it would be pretty soon, but I didn't know exactly how soon, which is pretty typical. And I got it back to make final revisions on it a couple days ago and resubmitted it. There could always be something that, an I that I didn't dot or a T that I didn't cross. I'm actually a little bit nervous that one of the games that has a pun name, Dante's Inferno, which was corrected to Dante's Inferno, I then recorrected back to Dante's Inferno, but I'm a little worried that without explaining that, it might just get re-corrected. And so that's the kind of thing I'm sort of thinking about at the moment. But just to mention the Christmas break, this is a strange Christmas break for several reasons. A, both you and I are teachers, and generally the Christmas break is when we get to do all of our extra things. But you're on paternity leave, and I'm on fellowship. So, and I didn't even have time. And I hate using that expression. I did not have time, but I did not make the time because I did not think I had the time to even play our video game that we're playing and talking through for side quests. And so it's a very strange Christmas break because not only is it not a relief from the usual thing, in some ways it is for you, but also, you
Yeah.
have a high pressure new dad sort of situation going on. I mean, it's your third kid, but still, new situation. Definitely some stress, I imagine.
Oh yeah.
But it's not your usual relaxing time where you just get to do or get to do more of what you want to do. Perhaps it is more like that for you at the moment than it is for me, but I've not yet hit my Christmas break stride, as it were.
I tell you, the most stressful thing about Christmas with kids is making sure that you've got enough presents of the right sort that
Mm,
they're gonna enjoy and
oof.
not become little hellions complaining about this like free gift that they've been because that's the worst, is the ingratitude. I mean, King Lear had it absolutely right on that. I mean, on the
Oh,
nose.
oh,
Uh,
yeah,
but
and
I
especially because it's
think
Santa's fault, not yours. So they're not.
there you go. Yeah, very true, very true. And I think that the team of elves working with Santa has hopefully come through this year. So I'm not too stressed right now. And yeah, it's tricky because it's like I do have time, but I don't have a lot of bandwidth is the other thing.
Sure.
It's like I can do
Right.
certain kinds of things
Yeah.
pretty well, and other things are a real struggle. Like I'll tell you, eating your paper, I really got a lot from the portions that I was able to like focus on. And then the parts of it that I was like bounced off of is like so the more technical, the more heuristic, like theory laden sections of the paper, I had a really hard time like processing what you were doing a lot of nuanced things with the adaptation versus appropriation and the different like layers of that and the different sort of scholarly views on that. And it's a little bit outside my ken, although I have tried to read it a couple times. Whereas like all the video game stuff, I was like, oh yeah, I can really follow the argument here. I'm digging this part. So I don't know if that was your impression as you were writing it as well. Like probably some parts of this were easier to write than others, and then uh, like you said, there's still parts of it that you're probably still tinkering with up to the very last minute here. So yeah, if you want to just like say something about your process writing
Yeah.
this paper. Yeah.
No, I mean that's amazing that you put your finger on it like that because this essay has taken 6 months and it's a 42 page long essay and my scholarly output prior to this was a 14-page article and a 17-page article, so I've more than doubled my career scholarly output. And in fact, this article itself could be 3 articles, and I think that's something that you sort of have gotten into, and it's sort of also something that starts to happen when a journeyman scholar is moving from to do sort of an essay length project to a book length project.
Mhm.
All
Mhm.
of a sudden, the articles start to get abnormally long, a little too long, even. In fact, this article is around 16,000 words, and there's a 15,000 word limit on the Biblioteca Dantesca. But like you noticed, sort of like Sephiroth reading in the basement of the Shinra mansion, crazy amount of volume and taking it all in a very short amount of time. I wrote this piece really, really, really fast
Mhm.
because I had originally wanted to write an entry for the Dante Encyclopedia that's coming out from Routledge
Mhm.
in the next year or so on Dante and video games. But the editor, who I is a colleague and I consider a friend, Elizabeth Coggeshall, said, "Well, this piece, I actually suggested two pieces, neither were accepted. And she said,
Mhm.
these are both interesting pieces. And if you want to follow up on them, I actually have a couple journals to suggest them to. And, but the one problem is that rather than submitting and this was in June when I heard back from them, instead of submitting in October and having 4 months to work on this article while also working on my dissertation and applying for jobs, um, the Biblioteca Dantesca deadline was June 30th, which I found out about in June. And I also was in Oxford preparing for a presentation at a conference that both of us went to, the Manchester Game Center.
That was
And
great.
that presentation was on a different piece itself. Um, uh, and so I was really thinking about that was a piece on Final Fantasy VIII. This is a piece on a little bit on Devil May Cry and Dante's Inferno, but mostly on Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII.
Mhm.
But I wrote a lot of that fast, and it was just kind of coming out of me. When I got the piece back from initial review, it was already 30 pages long. Um, and so now it's 42 pages long, but it was 30 pages long when it had a bibliography because now it's formatted in such a way as to where there are footnotes that
Yeah.
include citations rather than this like a kind of typical European way of doing things. Dante Studies does it like this too. There are a lot of journals that do it like this now. And it looks pretty professional when you look at the actual just like formatting. It makes sense. But so one of my reviewers liked the work, but was critical of the scholarly impact it would have theoretically, and thought that I was using the term adaptation a little bit too loosely. And so I was going to address that in a pretty robust footnote, but then I ended up reading a lot on adaptation and
Yeah.
appropriation theory, and it turns out that it's sort of an this is a very scholarly slash AI term here, but I'm underdeveloped, under theorized,
Mhm.
how we often say, and especially the connection between literature and video games. And there's a lot of debate between narratologists and ludologists on what exactly that relationship is. And so I decided I would try and give some insight into that in order to add to the scholarly value of the text and also the value of um, or rather, and to the sort of subfield of adaptations, adaptation theory, and in particular adaptations from written narratological media to ludological slash narratological media, like an RPG, which is both.
Mhm.
Um, and so I took that as an opportunity to just make the paper more impactful and to be more useful for more amounts of scholars. I would also say that that makes the work a little bit less of an Italianist work and more of a comparative literature piece as well, which is my specific field. So I think you're right to notice that the juice, the meat, as it were, is the video game analysis, and that's
Yeah.
the kernel, the core of the article. But the armor plating around it is again, yeah, more necessary for not the video game analyst and the sort of literary video game and philosophical scholar that you are, but more for like a comparativist
Mhm.
who's really interested in adaptation theory. And it is an interesting set of it is an interesting theory with an interesting scope.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot to do on it now because of the amount of types of adaptations that are happening. And this is something we've talked about even for our own mutual explorations. Uh, and I've brought this up sort of subtly, but like continuing to move in the adaptation space and then move on also to looking at the Final Fantasy VII collection and
Totally.
at how it adapts itself. So not only looking at how, say, elements from Dante get adapted in Final Fantasies as well as other video games, but how does a video game 20 years later adapt itself, or even 30 years later almost at this point?
So on this note, I will say the names that I recognized in the theory portion, I mean, of course, Huizinga, who gets kind of his own little mini section,
Uh-huh.
like transitioning from the literary narratology to the game. And then Arseth, Cybertext is a core kind of foundational. Hamlet on the Holodeck by Janet Murray, core foundational texts. And then on the literary side, you've got like, or I'm more the cultural historian, popular culture guy, Henry Jenkins, major
Yes.
name. Haven't really read any of his stuff other than like a few short pieces, but he's obviously really interesting, kind of early theorist there as well with those other two. And then Gerard Genette, if I'm pronouncing that right,
Yeah.
he I have heard of but never read any of his work, and that's in a kind of area that I consider quite scary and quite tenebrous, if you know what I mean. It's
Oh,
like
yeah.
it's this sort of the edges of a very dangerous I don't know. I worry about those French scholars of that era. There's some that I really dig, and there's aspects of their work that I really like. But others I just find deeply pernicious. And I don't know what to say about him because like I said, I haven't read his work, but it seems like it's quite useful because you kind of get these key terms of the pastiche, the bricolage, and that's kind of where you fuse a lot of the other more recent scholars, right? The more active current ones into that kind of kernel, throw that with the studies, uh, studies of his, and then you kind of are off to the races uh, with the four games, right? And I think each one kind of builds on the last. And so from there, I was like, okay, I kind of know what to do with this now. But yeah, yeah.
So yes, I appreciate that, and I do have some historical scholars, and I have actually heard you and Ben discuss Arseth and Hamlet on the holodeck a little
Okay,
bit in one of your discussions. Um,
long ago, yeah.
Something about Jeanette that's interesting is yes, it might be easy to see him in like the tradition of like a Roland Barthes or a
Mhm.
Michel Foucault or a Derrida, and to start thinking he might be one of those structuralists or post-structuralists. He um he comes a little bit after them. They had their heyday in the 70s, he in the late 80s and 90s, but his work on palimpsests, he also got to work on narratology or narratives as well as paratexts. But two things about him. One, he comes a little bit after them.
Mhm.
Two, he's a literary theorist, not just a philosopher, which I say importantly because in the same way that I am first and foremost a Dante scholar, and then also use aspects of theory. He was a Proust scholar.
Okay.
And there are certain works, Ulysses, In Search of Lost Time, that I consider of preeminent difficulty and importance. And if a scholar can cut cut their teeth, as it were, against such a work, that they're not just going to be some mere theorist. And so, as smart as Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, and Derrida are, and I hope some scholar listens to this because this is really a kind of dynamic claim. I don't
Mhm.
think any person in a philosophy department comes anywhere close to somebody who has to teach and write on Dante, Ulysses,
Right. Yeah.
and In Search of Lost Time, a 2,000-page masterwork. These are works that I think change the nature of the relationship between the philosophy department and the literature department. And so the literature scholars who then use theory, I think, come at it from above rather than below. And so something different about Girard is that he had a text to root himself into, and
Mhm.
a text, and a
Okay.
text that none of those other thinkers had ever showed the capacity to analyze in the same way that he does. And so
Yeah.
so I your sense is correct, and he is very close to that tradition. But if you read him, I think you'll find that he's extremely useful. He is a
Cool.
little playful. He is very much a French academic in the way that French academics are different from American academics. But I found myself really, really, really absorbing him in a way that, and obviously I come from literature departments in a way that I've never absorbed Foucault or Derrida or
Mhm.
Barthes or any of them like those. I should also mention that another thinker that sort of gets lumped in with them, Julia Kristeva, is also a Proust scholar.
Uh,
And so something I would look for and other scholars could argue against me, but I'd be happy to continue this argument against them. Um, Look at what they wrote their dissertation on. Look at what made them a serious thinker. And so with Jeanette being a Proust scholar, this is the perhaps the most difficult work written in French ever.
Yeah.
Uh, to me, that really empowered his thinking. And when he was going through all of his different sorts of pastiche and bricolage and parody and a million different sorts of uh, um, adaptations, I didn't find it just pedantic or annoying or him just trying to show off his own brilliance. I found it deeply helpful. And so for me that's very unique because I don't always find all of the French theorists as helpful.
Sure.
And so I agree that these are dark, tenebrous waters. Maybe snot green, maybe wine dark. It's hard to say. But the Jeanette for all of that caution is, I think, really, really, really worth dipping one's toe into. I would highly recommend, and we should read through him together. And he can also be read in French or English. I cited him in English because I had to read him really, really fast. I now looking back wish I had cited him in French, especially because he's an adaptation theorist. But
That is something I noticed about the paper as well. Yeah, you give a lot of primary source citations in the original language. And I guess that's probably again part of the convention of the publication,
yes,
which is, for scholars of Dante, primarily they're gonna want to just see the Italian and not any particular translation, I guess, which is cool. And I think that again, like you're saying, gets at what's distinct about sort of the layers of the work of the French scholars and other scholars that I think are more substantial. It's like where they're engaging with the text in a way that I can follow, and they're like engaging with the language that the author uses in a way that I can make up my own mind about. I'm all for that. Like I think they're quite good scholars, right? They knew their
yes,
Greek, they
no, of
knew
course.
their Latin, and so on. But then when they sort of devolve into wordplay in French, and then it's a little bit less useful for me, or Italian or whatever. Like I think even of like an Eco, right? Umberto Eco, he kind of toys with this same stuff in some ways, and I think it's really the people who come after them who will draw on them without going back to the things that they're really engaged with in the history of, the great books or whatever. That's where it really starts to come apart in some scary ways, and it gets very into like a post-structuralist, but also um, like a very superficial kind of Marxism gets mixed in with that, and a materialism that's quite unreflecting, and that just seems very disjointed from, actual lived experience, being a person in the world. So that, yeah, I think there's a kind of intellectual crusade that one could carry out against the current wave of that movement, which I think is really unhelpful, actually, because I don't think that they've actually um, got enough substance to really be worth engaging with. Whereas, if you, yeah, at some point have the bravery, the courage stat is high enough to read some of these French, especially in their original language, that would be, yeah. But I mean, I'd much rather just read Proust, right? To be honest, I'm
Well, that's
okay
where you
with,
start. That's where you, I mean, I think
yeah,
that's a good, I think, work of scholarship. You should be able to do what you basically did.
yeah.
Skip the necessary scholarship if that's not what's interesting to you, and get to the kernel of it. And it
Mhm.
should, and a good piece of scholarship should be upfront about, and this is why I try and give sections about, here's where it is. This is what I'm saying. This is my major point.
Yeah.
This will be useful to you. And it's funny because if you were to have watched me writing this, I really started with what's most important. And this is something I should say about my process,
Mm.
which is maybe different from a lot of scholars' processes. There are some that are very disorganized and somehow get it together. They're rare. There's some that are extremely organized. They're a little more common.
Mhm.
I'm more of just a process person. I try and say what's most important and then add what's most necessary to make it scholarship.
Mhm.
So I try to start with an idea or a couple ideas or what I'm trying to say or what I think is is accurate or true, and then make my case, and then look for evidence against the case, and and occasionally also find stuff that or evidence that works in my favor. But if it doesn't, I change what I'm saying or say that what I discovered is different from what I initially thought. But right, it's sort of like what Aristotle says about character being necessary to education. You have to form the character first, he claims in the Nicomachean Ethics, and then you can train somebody.
There you go.
It's the same with my articles. I start with what I think is most valuable, and then I add what is necessary in order to get it published. I think also helpful and more accessible to many different sorts of scholars too is the other thing. So in some ways, all of the scholarship can be sort of impenetrable to somebody who's not reading for it. But in
Mhm.
other ways, it can make it more useful to people coming from different arenas. And so the fact that I have like 10 pages on adaptation theory, there are a lot of people that work on adaptation theory. There are a lot of people that work on adaptation theory in video games. And even if they don't care about Final Fantasy or Dante, those 10 pages might be of use to them just to see how I've brought some of the
Mhm.
literature together, and they might find me necessary. And this is my big scholarly desire.
You want to get cited. Yeah.
If the work is good and gets out there enough, people may find that it's necessary to cite it because it makes a good
There you go.
point, and that it becomes part of the usual, like a Linda Hutchin or a Julie Sanders or a Gerard Jeanette. And that would be very nice, not just from like a professional level, but like from like what you desire to accomplish as a professional, not
Right.
to do good work that other pros value. And so that was really what one of my reviewers was pushing for.
Mhm.
The reviewer was like, "This is good work. This is good, and it's fine, but it could be more, and
Mhm. Mhm.
it could offer more." And I took that very seriously, and that's part of why the work got up to, I was being a little cagey. And this is something I do. I don't give perfect works to my initial reviewers. I give sort of proof of concept, and then I do a
Mm.
massive amount of work between my first and second edits. I try to really make it almost like, is this even the same writer?
Yeah.
But once it gets through the first review, and I know that the journal is serious about publishing the work and really has invested enough time and energy to give me reviewers and to give me feedback, I take that seriously. And so sometimes why scholarly works are very scholarly, and philologists will always be the most scholarly. They'll have more footnotes than actual writing on the page.
Yeah.
It's because other scholars have pushed us to be more scholarly, even though we start with our initial sort of intellectual kernel. But yeah, so I just hope I don't build up enough layers of sediment of scholarship that you can't get to the gold. Uh,
No, it's not at all. Yeah, I think as a reader who wants to get to the video games, there is not so much apparatus or footnotes or anything like that in the way of getting there. And like you said, this makes it a more powerful ripple effect going forward. Now that you have done this work, it seems like something that's going to be highly transferable to, all right, I'm going to look at this game and this game and this game now and
yes.
see how I can kind of weave that in. And yeah, eventually, inevitably, I think that there's a book in there as well, right? The ways that video games as a whole carry forward this kind of great conversation, right? In the line of the great works that they're influenced by, whether consciously or unconsciously. And I think one other element here, um, you mentioned kind of the pedagogical, but there's also the psychological, and that's implicit. It's kind of buried in the footnotes. But I know that's also one of your backgrounds, like along with the medievalism and the languages, you have that kind of hobbyist. I don't know that you've ever studied it officially, but you've definitely like read all the books. And I just would throw in like the name Joseph Campbell, somewhat derided, but highly influential. He also um, kind of wedded an interest in James Joyce and this interest in folklore mythology and psychology. And he kind of creates this very popularized form, even that has kind of threaded its way, dangerous in another way from the French, but threaded its way into lots of kind of imitators. And even in like current curricula in schools, they talk about the hero's journey and don't really reflect on what that is, where it comes from. How is this journey different from that journey, and this hero different from that hero? And the like the harmartia, right? We just sort of throw that around like we know what it means, very, very unhelpfully. Um, but maybe that's just the way that education has to be. I don't know, like for where we are now in the media landscape we're in. All that to say, there is you know, that aspect as well, the psychological, which I think is super important because that connects with the individual player. Like, what impact does this have on a person's life? I feel like that's something that we're often circling around and would be um, of interest again to certain readers in much the same way that the adaptation theory would be of interest to certain readers, depending on their scholarly or whatever kind of perspectives. So that's an area that I would be like, if I were the reader of this, I'd be like, wait, that's just in a footnote? Like, come on, we need a little more of the psychoanalytic or the collective unconscious or whatever angle you want to go at with that. But I know that's kind of a can of worms for one who's a comparative literature person, because there is a lot of baggage with that in literature departments now. So.
Well, so yeah, no, so yeah, I did kind of throw that into a footnote because I was talking about the notion of transformation and the transformative potential playing a video
Yes.
game, and also of reading the Divine Comedy as opposed, and of course, the Divine Comedy itself witnesses various sorts of transformations and failed
Yeah.
transformations, not only among the wayfarer who seems to go through some sort of transformation, but of course, the souls, the shades, and the
Hmm.
purgatory are also in the process of transforming. And yeah, this Eva Papiasfili is a psychoanalyst who has a book on Dante and psychoanalysis. And so one thing I had to really restrain myself from doing in my article was deriding Eva's many, many, many errors.
Uh,
I mean, no Italian at all, which is, I think people who don't do comparative literature or literature don't understand how derivative their thoughts immediately are if they have to
mm,
rely on other scholars just to get at the text. It's just hard. It just changes the nature of one's engagement with the work, while also changing the capacity to give major insight as well, really limiting that hole, the aperture through which insight comes. That said, I thought the work was really interesting. Obviously, this is a psychoanalyst trying to show some psychoanalysis, and I think inappropriately trying to apply psychological terms to fictional characters and also possibly to Dante. This is an overextension of the
mm,
concepts. There is a tension within literary studies, which I think also needs more theorizing between applying psychoanalytic concepts to a person that is being analyzed by an analyst and
uh,
also applying these concepts to fictional characters slash
uh,
authors who wrote these characters, who obviously one does not analyze in an analytical context. But because of that, I think it is actually more my place as a literary scholar to use these concepts because A, I'm aware of the original language. B, I don't make egregious errors when reading the text. I know what happens in the text itself. And C, I am more aware of the difficulty and differences between attempting to analyze somebody in an analytic framework and reading a book.
mhm.
And there are, believe it or not, big differences between the way of analyzing these two different things. This is way different from just differing media. That said, I mean, you're right. I have read a lot of psychoanalysis, and not just in the Freudian vein. And there are many people who just read a lot of Freud. There are many, and in the Freudian tradition,
Mhm.
there are a lot of people that read in the Jungian tradition. They go sort of different directions. I read them both and have read them both, and find differing levels of value from differing texts in either in all this in those both in those two traditions. Um, but right, I think psychoanalysis, like Ulysses, and they came around at about the same time, in the early 20th century, a little bit late 19th with Eugen Bleuler and Freud. The idea is one of transformation, whether it be social transformation or individual transformation. And this is something that Dante's Divine Comedy is all about as well. And actually happens to be the subject of my dissertation, transformation in
Ah,
Dante's
ah.
um, Divine Comedy. And so all that goes to say, and I've been very critical, psychoanalysts, French thinkers, I'm really like running my mouth today.
Even Barolini herself comes in for some scathing remarks here,
Well,
no?
she is of course one of the top Dantists and definitely I think the top American Dantist, but she gives a very typical popular response to the game, which I don't
Mhm,
think is
mhm.
inaccurate. But the claim I make, I think, is also accurate, which is that her dismissal of the game becomes a dismissal of the genre.
One of
Or
the strongest points in the paper, I would say. That's like one of the biggest takeaways for me. Yeah, so I really like that point.
right. And so that's also one of my bit of scholarship there is reorienting and reappraising and also bringing these, I think, deeper, much more valuable video games into the fray. It's like, well, if you only judge novels based on Dan Brown, then you're never going to think that a novel can have depth. But if you add Ulysses to your analysis or In Search of Lost Time, I think you're going to think very different things about the nature of the medium or the genre. And so I think that, like you said, is one of the most important things about this. Not only talking about how the text itself or an experience with a piece of art can transform oneself, but how to transform misperceptions and prejudices among scholars and among and those who read scholars and then duplicate their prejudices. And I'm like, well, I'm a Dante scholar. I have every reason in the world to turn up my nose at basically every piece of literature in existence, even great literature. But I don't turn up my nose at this. And so I give all this argumentation to suggest that others shouldn't as well. And I think there's some power to that. I could easily just uh, focus on issues in Dante and not look at adaptation and not look at video games, but I think there is something transformative in them. I think Dante would have appreciated this too. He
Yeah.
obviously wrote in the vernacular rather than in standard scholastic Latin.
Mm.
So to experience him through new appropriations and through new media in new genres, transmedia, as it were,
Mm.
as it's called sometimes, is something that he would appreciate. So I think it's also something that Dante scholars should not forget as well, is that he was himself engaged in working across genres in different media. He wrote philosophy, he wrote lyric poetry, he wrote an epic poem, he wrote in different languages, both Italian, Tuscan dialect at the time, and in Latin. So he's both cosmopolitan and had a concern for transforming his culture while transforming his language while trying to represent the transformation of one's being in
Mhm,
either
mhm.
maybe a social, spiritual, or psychological way.
I
All that goes to say is that I definitely do want to write more on the connection
yeah.
between transformation, a psychoanalysis slash psychology, and Dante as well. And I think it's very rich. And as much as I criticize the psychoanalysts for not having control of the text that they're working with, I do appreciate their attempts.
Mm, mm. No, as you're saying, the text that comes to mind that I would love to see a paper on from you in the future would be as you're looking at Final Fantasy IX and then thinking about the number nine in Dante. Don't forget the Vita Nuova. Of course, you would never forget the Vita Nuova. It's where it all starts, right? And the thing about that book is that it's both the poetry and the poet thinking
Yes.
about and explaining the
Yes.
poetry. And I feel like that's a lot of what Final Fantasy IX is doing is trying to, in some way, explain itself through the game with all these allusions to earlier games and sort of this acknowledgement that it's on the cusp of perhaps something even greater, right? That's right before he goes and does the comedy. But the danger that I see there is that, in fact, the best is behind us, right? The agony or the anxiety of influence, right? It ratcheted up to 11 there, where it's like, what we're going to do in the future is not going to reach the level, imaginatively speaking, of what has already come. And I think there's a kind of wistfulness and nostalgia kind of baked into those late golden age JRPGs. And I feel that in Dante as well. And now, of course, he overcomes, right? That I don't know that all poets do, right? Keats never writes his great epic. Um, Shakespeare arguably doesn't rise to the level of the greatest poets when he goes after a long poem. Whereas when he's doing smaller kind of, those little dioramas that Sakaguchi is so enamored of, right? The plays, well, he's the best, of course. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It's something, I feel like there's something there. And and I think that's exactly what a Barolini is perhaps missing is the layers of complexity at work in a game. You can see superficially, of course, they can't stand with the source material. But if you really dig into all of what's going on, even the simplest game has, like Arseth would argue, right, a lot of that's extra textual and
Yeah.
that has a complexity and a structure of its own. You can't just, sort of analyze it with the tools of a wholly other medium and expect to understand what it's up to. And so I think you do a really good job of giving each game kind of its breathing room and acknowledging what it's doing, but then correctly, I think, focusing on Final Fantasy VII particularly and 8, which has a little bit more written about it, and so you're engaging with that master's thesis and that Polsland, is that her name? Dr.
Pausland, I think, it may be
Pausland.
Polsland, but I think I pronounce it as Pausland in my head. I've never actually
Okay.
spoken to her. I've just emailed with her.
She seems to have a really interesting take on the ludic element that's already there in the text, right? And so she's sort of doing the opposite, finding that in the original text. And then Gupta, right, from Harvard MA, has written a thesis about Final Fantasy VIII. I just find that delightful.
Yeah, no, it
So
was
yeah, there's just
really useful because I think that really helped me to make my case for the necessity of this. I'm like, well, there is something written on this, but we probably want somebody who's, at another level of
Mhm.
professionalization engaging with this as well. While also obviously citing him a bunch of times. And so if he's still in the game, even though it's a master's thesis. So I criticize it where it needs to be criticized. It's basically like I'm his teacher and he's a student, but I tried not to make it too much like that. But that is the difference in level. Maybe even more profound. That's the difference at least. But I did also raise up, I think, the level of his work by considering it professionally. And so even though everything, he's there are inaccuracies in his work as well as a master's thesis. I think I show that it has more value, more positive value than certainly negative value.
Oh yeah.
And I give it due veneration in terms of sort of starting the process of really integrating Final Fantasy VIII and the Final Fantasies into literary studies. Something I'll be interested to see is over the next year whether any other scholars try and go down this road. As you know, and as you've just mentioned, I have two pieces that I'm going to, and maybe even a third that I'm really going to be, that are going to be companions to this. Um,
Mhm.
One, we'll see if it gets accepted and if I have the occasion to write it, but on Dante's Divine Comedy and Chrono Trigger, due to an opportunity that you actually presented to me not very long ago. The zeitgeist of culture, something like
Mhm.
that, for Chrono Trigger, which itself, when I talk about adaptation theory, we'll have to talk about it being adapted not only from Divine Comedy into a video game, but perhaps also from the Super Nintendo to the PlayStation 1 as well.
Mhm.
And but then also I really want to write a Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy, or sorry, excuse me, Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy. Subordinate clause is the same as my first clause there. My coordinate clause. In any case, the Divine Comedy and Final Fantasy IX, like you said.
Yeah.
There are a lot of connections there. At the very end of the text, I drop another footnote in my most recent essay saying there's a lot to be analyzed there and probably should.
Mhm.
Um, and so I do want this to be the beginning of me writing a few pieces on this, but hopefully it serves as an invitation to others
Totally.
to write. Sometimes you have to be uh, So we've talked a little bit about what I do as a scholar. And so something I like to do is be path breaking. And there aren't a lot of other scholars who have done what I've done. They've done things around it, but I've tried to bring them together so that I can show that there are new avenues for research. And
Hmm.
again, not just so that I get cited and get like a good job. I mean, that's all great, but that's not why I do scholarship. That's just part of remaining a scholar, as it were. But
Being a scholar, staying yourself.
yes, right, exactly. The Joe Sachs version
There
of
you
it.
go.
But I wanted to comment on something that you said about Final Fantasy IX with how it, like the Vita Nova, perhaps collapses under the pressure of its own anxiety of influence,
Mm.
and say that I think that's a really interesting point that insofar as Dante is like Final Fantasy IX in the Vita Nova, he is perhaps looking back and thinking that there is no future in which he produces something better, but then obviously comes out with the Divine Comet. And did Final Fantasy find itself in such a position where Final Fantasy IX was sort of a culmination, not the same culmination as Seven, which would be more like the Divine Comedy, I would say, this unique creative force that exploded into the world. Whereas nine more is not the same sort of creative miracle, as it were, as Final Fantasy VII. Also, not the first iteration of a game on a system like Final Fantasy X or Seven. So it's missing that as well. But I do agree with you that it is a reflection on itself. It's Vivi and Zidane, and especially Vivi would seem to be a a symbol of the game itself, a temporary artificial thing made in a world of a bunch of temporary artificial things, which attains a level beyond that temporary artificiality, attains consciousness, and then has a value beyond the material that created him and his initial purpose in the world. And that is perhaps what a video game or a Final Fantasy can be, even though they had to be made under Sakaguchi every year and under terrible constraints. They still had to aspire towards being a masterpiece or a piece of art that would be worthy of being, or yes, would be worthy of the name of being part of a golden age. Um, so does the game does the game in recognizing and interrogating its own self-consciousness limit or expand its value? I think is an interesting question that maybe the future needs to be included with.
Hmm.
Did Final Fantasy X transcend 9 or 12 or 13 or 15? Maybe 11 and 14 are different because they're MMORPGs.
Hmm.
That's a tough question. But I would add to it, does it have to be a Final Fantasy or could it be an Expedition 33?
Sure.
Again, more questions. Is it because the team that worked on Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 9, those were different. I mean, they were different teams with different members. Certain key members were part of them, like Sakaguchi and Uematsu. But now the teams are totally different, and Square is Square Enix, and they have different CEOs, and even now they get into gacha games and sequels in a way that they never did under Sakaguchi. So the question for me becomes: did Final Fantasy IX put an Archimedean, line in the ground, as it were, for Final Fantasy or for RPGs, seemingly.
Hmm.
And 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 if it did, who is it the responsibility of a Final Fantasy to go beyond that, or another game influenced by it, like Expedition 33? The creator of that has been very open about his influence by
Right.
Final Fantasy, and so I guess what I'm trying to say, and I think I'm being very sloppy about it, is that I don't necessarily see Nine as a swan song, though I do see the huge influence and anxiety that you mentioned. I don't
Hmm.
know I don't know that that limits. I don't know if it limited, but I also couldn't say that it didn't.
No,
Uh,
that's the point. Yeah, this is a point you come back to, I feel like, when we talk about the game and your kind of question about whether one can both experience the transformation and
mm,
observe oneself experiencing the transformation in the same moment, or if it has to be a kind of perspectival thing, um, whereby a player can see what's happening to somebody else and experience something of that themselves. And then again, by replaying, by thinking back, they can then observe that experience, right? I think it's not that different from the classic and the romantic, right? Like the romantics have this kind of extra level of self-consciousness that at times is very fruitful. It certainly moves the language and the art in poetry or whatever medium, but at times has a kind of handicap as well, right? It can be, in fact, a crippling um, to their growth. It can even lead to outright, self-destruction in the extreme cases of a Chatterton, who we saw recently, um, dedicated uh, a, Keats dedicated a poem to him, or like a Rimbaud, right? In the French tradition, he sort of flames out and stops writing poetry, although he doesn't actually kill himself. So yeah, so I think there's elements of this in 8 as well, which you point out, right? A lot of Final Fantasy 8 is the character being shown these kind of visions that are supposed to, in some way, help him not make the same mistakes that his father did, right? And so I'm sure that there's elements of that in each of the games, that kind of self-reflection happening. And the funny thing about 8 is, right, that he's such an unreflective character outwardly, but we also do see his kind of internal monologue or dialogue going on throughout the game. So yeah, so that I just think, yeah, just adding on 9 along with 7 and 8 seems like a natural next step. You also mentioned uh, a very new game that's coming out, but you also mentioned a couple indie games like Undertale and Journey, I think is an indie game. I don't know. Anyway, but games that are talked about as art, in a way that
Yes.
um, yeah, you'd want to like interrogate a bit, probably. Yeah, yeah.
I have you ever played Journey? It was a free
No.
game available. So when I first bought my PS4 during COVID, I think in 2020, it was one of the free games that one could just download. And I had a free afternoon, and so I decided to go through it, and it's really interesting. There's just a like the Divine Comedy, or at least with the Purgatorio, there's a mountain in the distance. It looks sort of like a holy mountain. It's obviously the goal, but you kind of move towards the entire time. And if you're connected to the internet, you can be joined by another character who you never get to like speak to, but you can help at various times. And that character, the person playing that character, will change throughout your playing. So like different players from around the world can occupy that role for you. And so you get this sort of like ethereal experience helping somebody without really communicating much, and then they're gone.
Hmm.
And and it's a
That's a bit
little bit
like
like,
in
yeah, go on.
it's like in Nier Automata, I was gonna say. And I think there's elements of this in a lot of games as well. I can't remember. I think Persona 4 Golden, which
Mm.
is a re-release, has elements of this too, where like you can help each other across the internet. But yeah, but um this kind of thing is at play in that game, which I know was presented on at that conference in Manchester. There's a lot of interest around Nier Automata
Yes.
as well. So, but Journey is a much shorter experience. I take it, not an RPG in the same way. I haven't played it. I see it cited a lot. I see images and music from it.
Oh, it's really beautiful. It
Um,
takes like 2 hours, Wes.
yeah.
And like so you can go through it many times. It's really one of those games that you just kind of start playing and then you finish it because
Okay.
it's pretty. I don't know if you can even save but it really is an artistic experience, much different from a regular video game with levels. There are kind of levels, there are enemies. You can acquire things that help you, like eventually you can fly, but then if you get like injured, you can lose the ability and it gets very tough. But I only went through it a couple times, but it when I saw it mentioned in the literature, I think actually by Wilson in the Shakespeare volume, Shakespeare on the holodeck, um, or sorry, Hamlet on the holodeck. Get the alliteration. Um,
That's Murray. That's Janet Murray.
that's
Yeah.
her, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Janet Murray, the MIT professor. Somewhere I should probably look at trying to teach. I think they would like me. Um, she mentioned it, and I was pretty excited about that because I remember thinking the game was pretty
Okay.
spiritual and transformative. Oh,
Yeah, that's the word you've got there, spiritual, which is again, I mean, a bit like psychology, an angle on this that you might, I mean, it'd probably be a whole other theoretical apparatus you'd have to concoct there, but again, one that has some real life importance, I think, in a way that people don't ordinarily see games maybe fitting in, but that
right.
seem, insofar as their art and a reflection of their culture, of course, a major strand of that is always going to be the mythological, the religious, the spiritual, somewhere in that realm, and that overlaps with the psychological, the aesthetic, of course, all the,
And
whoops.
it helps when we have games like Expedition 33 coming out, though recent small scandal, though not really scandal, suggesting that they used AI and so lost their Independent Game of the Year award. Though apparently they
Hmm.
had gone back in and scrubbed out the AI. It was just used as a placeholder, and so it was just a tool.
Oh,
So interesting debates about the use or about what being creative is and what being sort of plagiarist is and how that relates to notions of spirituality and transformation and what art is and what it does and what needs to be put into it in order to produce this. This is, I think, another interesting sort of question. Instead of thinking about questions of authorship, thinking
hmm.
about questions of effect.
Yes.
Um, and so, can art which uses AI as a tool in some way or another still produce transformative effects on the viewers or the players? Would be one of the more important questions, perhaps even the most important question, even more important than who the author is, which is to some extent, or what the author is. It's to some extent an artificial question that was really became important during the Renaissance. Um,
Hmm.
it used to be the case that scholars in the tradition of a great scholar would sign the name of the scholar, and the idea was that their work would be so similar to the initial work that they would be seen as the same. And
Yeah.
this has been a problem with with Platonic dialogues and with Aristotle's works, for example. Certain works are considered perhaps not written by them, but one of their students. And which is actually known with some of Aristotle's works, like I believe his poetics was like the actual manuscripts are just like notes in ancient Greek that a student, like a high level student, must have taken while he was speaking. It's not even really a full text.
Interesting. No, yeah, and in terms of these games, right, authorship is very fraught as well. Even if
Right,
you don't take into the account the AI or whatever, I mean, it's a team, it's a collaborative thing,
right,
and the
right.
player experience is highly indicative of like the quality of the actual work, right? Like if you're not playing the game well, you probably won't get a very good sense of its actual value, right? And
I,
so there's
this
a
this is
tricky.
something we talk about all the time. As much as I love Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, you got deeper into 7, certainly into 8, and there's a lot of 9 that I have not yet experienced
uh,
myself going a little bit linearly through it.
Well,
But
you have a lot going on. I mean, to be fair. And so I know you've got, a million things. You've got your dissertation coming up very soon. You've got these other papers you're working on. Um, yeah, what is the next? Because you have a bunch of options here. What is the next step you're going to take with this particular? Is it the Chrono Trigger? I mean, if they do accept that, that would be like one of the next things, I guess.
yeah, so if I well, I need to finish my dissertation. I've got my doctoral defense date February 27th. I think these things are supposed to be public, so I'm probably going to get a Zoom link pretty
Cool.
soon, and I'll send it to you, and I'll link it here if anybody wants to listen to me really going hard. And I will be going hard during that. There will be no pretense of general interest.
No, no.
It will be
Okay.
all tough scholarship. But only in that venue, only for that time. I have to successfully pass the test to finish the transformation. And that I'll see if I can be conscious during it and feel myself change from Mr. to Doctor. But something tells me that I'll be pretty focused during that moment. But so I'm working on that. I'm having to send out job applications because my tenure at LSU is ending after
Mm.
I finish my dissertation, and I'll need to go work somewhere else. Um, and we'll see whether that ends up whether I end up unemployed or with a fellowship or with a professorship. Those are the sorts of jobs I'm looking for immediately. There are good reasons to do either. I have a lot more time to work if I do a fellowship. And that'll be sort of nice because I'm a pretty productive scholar. As much as I like to teach, I I've got a lot of thoughts and
Yeah.
I've got the desire and now the skill to produce them. And so besides all of that, yes, working on if I get the opportunity, the Chrono Trigger piece, that'll be right in line with this.
Hmm.
And I think will help to continue to develop adaptation theory and also just talk more about these golden age games and relate them to deep literature and to try and open up the field more to deep analysis across fields, analysts, psychoanalysts, literature analysts, whoever finds themselves attracted to this sort of thinking, while also really trying to make a sequel piece, maybe even in the Biblioteca Dantesca. We'll see if they're interested in a piece so similar so soon
Yeah.
on Dante and Final Fantasy IX, and maybe a second piece. I haven't quite decided whether I want to include like Final Fantasy V or 4 or Expedition 33, but or even a deeper analysis of 7 or 8 too, because
Hmm.
that's
Hmm.
something I don't think as long as this paper is that I wrote, I think there's a lot more to be said about Final Fantasy 7 and 8. I even have a whole nother paper on Final Fantasy 8 that I have yet to find the publisher for.
Oh,
And I'd also like to work on that a little bit because that was the paper that was a result of the conference we attended at Manchester.
cool. Yeah.
And so technically I should already have that out because I started it before
Yeah.
this paper, but this is the sort of linearity I have to work with as a scholar. Things work at there are differing rates of change in all the projects I'm involved in. And so I never know
Just
what's
just watch out for that time compression, that's all I'll say about
yeah,
that.
yeah. I mean, maybe I'll have to go back in time at some point, but I might change the future. And so, yeah, we're gonna have all sorts of weird time, and then add in the Final Fantasy VII sort of adaptation and
Yes.
changes
What's
that they
old is
have.
new again.
So,
I know, I know. And okay, so I mean, I know it gets kind of lost in the shuffle here too, but there's always Final Fantasy Tactics.
yes, no, I
And
don't want to forget that. It's
that
just that I
one,
haven't played it, and I know it's hard and it takes a long time. But I
it's a
do
time
have
sink for sure. Yeah.
Chronicles. I know that there's an adaptation question there because, in fact, Final Fantasy Union has a what is the most definitive version of Final Fantasy Tactics video, which
Yeah.
I should probably listen to and I would integrate into a paper. But yes, I don't want to forget about Tactics. I know it's a slightly different experience, but again, just it came out at the same time as Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VII, Xenogears,
Yep, yep.
Final Fantasy VIII, and people it was sort of a dark horse, but people who loved it, they said it was. I remember this argument constantly, better than Final Fantasy VII, even.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's again that like when I hear that something's a masterpiece, or I hear what people are saying about Expedition 33, my eyebrow shoots up, and I think, that's something that I really may have to get into that. And I did buy it because you told me about it and have been mentioning it. So I guess I should also mention Chrono Cross. Not everybody loves that, but I did love Chrono Cross. So I'll
Oh
put that
yeah,
with Final Fantasy VIII. I just don't think about I didn't play Chrono Trigger, so I don't have any issues like
for
that.
sure.
I have now, and I love Chrono Trigger, but I loved Chrono Cross before I played Chrono Trigger, so I didn't hate it as a result of having played the one and then the second one.
Being disappointed. Well,
Yeah, being disappointed and not reflecting it enough. And
the last one I'll throw out, I think I just texted you about it.
yes,
Limbus Company. Um, it's it's a very strange game. Like I did start playing it and it was too much for me. Like way too much. But I know there's good stuff there. It features Dante or a character named Dante. And it features a lot of themes and imagery that are recognizably Dantesque, but it does it through a really strange mechanical system,
Hmm.
a really strange development cycle where like chapters or cantos, I think they call them, are released every so often to expand the game as you go. It's free to play, but then there's things you can buy and within it, and there's other references to many, many other books. Like each canto is like about a character from literature, but they've been, you know, grotesquely changed in some way by this world that they're trapped in. And Dante's job is to like free these lost souls. And some Ben is all about this game. He's so into it. Um,
We might need to have him on.
yeah,
I don't want to ask anybody to do actually. I need to tell the listeners that I was supposed to play a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours of the video game and talk to you, and I had to text you and say, Wes, I know we need to podcast. I'm so
there's
slammed right now. I don't even have time to play the video game. Would you
there's
want
too
me to
much.
spend a couple hours reading my most recent article instead? And then you said yes, which so the viewer should know that you're really a great friend and a fellow podcaster partner here,
Totally.
constant companion and party member, as it were, perennial party member. And but if he wanted to look this over and talk about Dante, uh,
Hmm.
or sorry, that Limbus Company game as well, that might be pretty. That might be interesting. Just because then he could talk about something he really loves,
Yeah.
and
Get another person on board, another professor on board. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
and I do have a friend Otto Lato who's over at NYU doing
Oh
his
yeah.
second postdoc over there right now. And he's a really interesting European scholar, Finnish guy who's really an intellectual, interested in a lot of things, including video games. And he comes from philosophy departments, so he's got a slightly different skill set, or very
Okay.
different skill set, depending. Um, and just kind of an excited guy, and he was really interested in this piece when I got to see him in New York City recently, and
Okay.
I think would be a good guest. I think, again, scholar but intellectual, which is I think even more important for being on a good podcast.
Totally. Okay. So yeah, we've got no shortage of next steps then. Um, I should probably run. I know you've got things going on as well, but yeah, no, it was a pleasure to finally get to read this, and yeah, just congrats on getting it through all that long process to the finish line.
Rigmarole.
It's very impressive. Awesome work,
Well,
and good luck on the dissertation. That's the next hurdle.
thank you. I've got some bit that I'm turning in today. So long as I live the day correctly, and I really appreciate it. I myself honored that you took the time to read this, especially when you could have been doing anything else. Um, and again, I think I saw your most recent
Yeah,
child, Daniel Michael.
he's just snoozing here. You know, he's
Um,
just
Good to see him. Master Thrash was here in the beginning. Now Daniel, and we so the stars in the making have gotten to be featured. The two people who are featured more and more, or rather the two entities that are featured more and more. Daniel's a person. Master Thrash is a dog. As much as I love him, uh, not an insult to call him that. Um, but yes, thank you. And I'm looking forward to getting back to our more regularly scheduled programming
Mm,
in the next week or so. Even though I'm going to be gone most of this weekend through the weekend, I might still be able to meet this weekend. We'll be in contact, but at the latest, sometime during the week next week. And
yeah.
so listeners, wait up. You might have to wait till Tuesday or Wednesday. I think probably Tuesday because I think Wednesday, Thursday are sort of New Year's sort of days.
Oh yeah.
So
All the holidays.
all
You
the
know it.
holidays, right?
Yeah. Safe travels. Yeah.
Thanks.
Enjoy the holiday.
And I'll see you later for a night school on Endymion.
Yeah. A little bit of reading to do still. Yep. Looking forward to that. Thanks for the reminder.
All right, see you, my friend.